Joe, I thank you very, 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 very much for attending this show, for being a guest. I've been watching your content for years by now. It's been very interesting, very informative. Your YouTube channel is quite a big one in the financial sector. You've got over 180,000 followers alone on that platform on YouTube. So I would like to ask, now that I've got you here, I'm a bit curious. How did it all start, your private journey into the financial sector? Like, how did all of that come to be?
Yeah, great question. So when my wife and I got married, we were about $30,000 in debt, and I was making less than minimum wage at the time. So we were in a bit of a financial pickle. And so I thought to myself, I need to get us out of this hole that I got us into, because it was mostly my debt. And so I started reading some basic personal finance books to figure out how this whole money thing worked, and really kind of fell in love with it. I really I became very curious, and was very excited about the stuff that I was learning. And I was thinking to myself, hey, I want to go into this more. And I had a friend who was a stockbroker. So I started talking to him about it, and he said, hey, look, if you're really interested in this stuff, you could get a job. I could help you get a job doing this. And I thought, what better way to learn about all this than from, inside the belly of the beast. So that's what I did. I got a job as a broker trainee. And for the next 5 years, worked as a stockbroker, did a bunch of different things. And all along the way, I've always I've continued to have this curiosity about how the financial system works, how the economy works, how money works. And so that was kind of the driving force behind the different roles that I took, trying to weave my way through the system. And it got to a point where I just was not finding the answers that I was expecting to find, and I was not finding answers that made sense. And so, I basically got to a point where I was like, you know what, if I want to be able to learn how this all works, I have to start, studying outside of just, what comes down the pipeline in my job. So I started reading books, like searching for podcasts, YouTube channels, and stuff like that. And I kind of stumbled into Austrian economics, and I think Peter Schiff was one of the original introductions that I had into that kind of field of thinking. And it just it was completely different than anything that I had encountered from inside the industry, and kind of really opened my eyes. And it's basically, like, the way that I like to describe it is like Newtonian physics. It describes a lot of phenomena that we can observe, but it doesn't describe a lot of stuff once you start being able to observe stuff that happens out in the universe with telescopes. And Einsteinian physics, the theory of general relativity, explains everything that Newtonian physics explains, but just more so than that. And so it's, I kind of, when I stumbled onto Austrian economics, it kind of really opened my eyes, and it was just like, oh no, this actually makes more sense. It has more explanatory power and better predictive power about the way the financial system works than what I have experienced so far with the standard Keynesian economics. And so just started learning more about that on my own. And then it got to a point where I was like, you know what, based on what I know now about how everything actually works and what I'm doing for a career, what I'm selling people, it was starting to not align. And I was like, you know what, I just don't feel like I can do this for much longer. And so I decided to quit. I started Heresy Financial, and my only goal was to teach people about how money really works at that point. And so I started my YouTube channel. I started a podcast. I self-published some books. I did some consulting, and my YouTube channel is the first thing that kind of took off. And so for the last 3 years now, I've been focusing on growing that, always with the, kind of the goal, the vision of teaching as many people as possible about how money really works, the financial system, the economy, that economic machine. And so that's how I got to where we are today.
Now I understand where the heresy comes from. Very interesting. That's a cool thing. For the views, I love how you you've got two parts in your content often. It's like, okay, the news cycle of daily stuff where it's like, okay, what happened right now? What is the important things that are going on in the economy? But you always take time to explain in simple terms for the viewer, like, okay, what is behind it? What is inflation? What is deflation? What are the different movements in the markets? What are the different cycles that we go through? I think that's a very nice thing, because a lot of channels or a lot of educators in that area are either very high in the technicalities where like, poof, if I'm a beginner, I don't understand 90% of the terms and I can't follow him. And the others focus too much on the basics. So it's like, if you know already some stuff, it's like a bit boring and they take too much time. I think you're treading a very great line when it comes to that, honestly spoken.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you say that, actually, because that's very intentional, and I wasn't sure if people actually picked up on that. But the thing that I like to do the most is to take something that's complex and then be able to take all the parts that are important out of that and distill it down into something that's easy to digest. And so that's what I like to do. But if I only do that, then the videos are not really enticing, because like nobody wants to sit there and click on a video to watch about the marginal utility value theory. Like it's not something that people are very interested in. But a lot of people are interested in what's happening with Silicon Valley Bank collapsing or Credit Suisse or something like that. So when you can weave those together, then it's at least I try and do that. So thanks.
Absolutely. That's why I'm so hooked on your stuff. And it's also, as you know, there's always something happening in the markets, always something happening.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting take. What I also want to point out, what I personally think is cool with you, is like you're not a doomsday predictor. Of course, there are negative cycles, there are news, there are things that happen or that can be happening that are negative, where like, okay, guys, you got to watch out for inflation, or you got to watch out for X, Y, Z, and so on. But it's not like all the time, oh my God, everything's gonna go down, everything's gonna crash, everything's gonna doom, shit hit the fan, you need to get bullets and so on. But it's like, okay, the market is gonna move in this way. How can you profit off of it? What is the technicality? What is the chance? And you're not like saying, hey, that's what's going to happen, but more like in a general point of view, like, okay, listen, if inflation happens, then usually it means this, this, this. If this happens, then it usually means this, this, this. If those things are going to happen, you're most likely able to win from that situation through X, Y, Z, and this and so on. So I think that's a very nice thing that you do too. If I can, now that I've got the chance to give you a bit feedback, it's really something I like a lot about your content. And
thank you.
There is one thing though that is a bit more heavily in the negative area of it. It's a CBDC topic where I say that's a threat to freedom, as you would say it, if I'm repeating. Why do you think so? What is if someone has not heard about CBDC yet, what would you say is it, and what's the danger behind it?
Yeah. I'll answer that by explaining really quickly what the different forms of money. So we've got, number one, we've got commodity money, and that's like thousands of years in the past. People had gold and silver coins, or sometimes seashells, or sometimes cows, or sometimes lambs, or sometimes rice. You had a commodity that operated as money. So when people engaged in transactions, a physical commodity would actually exchange hands. Now that's great from this, especially something like gold. That works really well for the most part, because it's a very limited supply. It's hard to create more of it. It lasts forever. It won't decay on you. And it's hard to forge or fraudulently, like counterfeit it. And so there's a lot of great characteristics about something like, gold being money that caused it to be the dominant form of money for so many thousands of years. There's a negative side to it, though, and that's that it's hard to transact across large amounts of space. So it's good for like small local economies. But if I wanted to, buy something from China and I'm living in the United States, let's say, 500 years ago, if I was, a Native American and wanted to sail across the sea to buy something from China, well, that'd be really difficult, because I would have to actually put gold on a boat and ship it over there? And what if the boat gets, shipwrecked, or what if there's pirates or something like that? So it's very costly to transact across a large distance with a commodity. And so the invention that eventually became commonplace was a commodity-backed money system. And that's where you, instead of the commodity itself changing hands, you have ownership of that commodity changing hands. The commodity stays in the same place, though. And so that's what a bank was. A bank just took all of the gold and held it. And then you have a piece of paper that says you own that gold. And when you want to buy something, you change that paper moves hands. So all that's happening is the ownership of that gold is changing hands. And so what that allows you to do is it allows you to have transactions across larger distances for a much lower price, because number one, paper weighs less than gold does. Number two, all you have to do is confirm that ownership of that gold has changed hands. And the more you centralize that and scale that up, the larger the distances you can transact. And that's why the central bank in the United States allowed much greater commerce to happen across the state boundaries, instead of having, each state has its own money and businesses have to worry about, the differences in the banking systems and rules from state to state. You centralize that so it makes commerce easier across.
A bit like what the EU does for the European market, where it's like a bit more newer, but the same idea. Many different players who say, okay, you know what, we're going to do one currency, we're going to do one thing that we can share and we all accept as payment from now on. So it's easier for the markets to interact with one another. We in Europe, until a few years, it's now already decades, but it was like, if you go from Austria to Germany and then further to Sweden, and so you had to change your currency 3-4 times in the time span of sometimes 2 or 3 days, and each time it cost money, and each time it was bothersome. But sorry, yeah.
No, you're exactly right. It's exactly the same idea there on the benefits that it brings. And you bring up a good point, actually, because whenever we're discussing, changes or things happening in economics, there's always a trade-off. So yes, there are good things about it, and there are winners as a result. And one of those winners might be large corporations that have the ability to grow easily across state lines now. And one of the losers might be the small mom and pop shop that can't compete now because a big corporation moved in down the street, that they wouldn't have been able to do that because of the lack of efficiency with, the different forms of money before. And so there's always a trade-off. There's always winners and losers. There's no such thing as like perfect for everybody. You always have to ask what's the cost, basically.
Yeah, we had that in Europe, for example, a few years ago with the financial crisis in Greece, where it was like, usually an economy that's in a bad situation can get out of it by inflation. Not just inflation, but also by their value losing worth in exchange for other currencies. So the market usually has a bit of an advantage in exporting their goods to other markets, because their work, labor, and resources are cheaper. Now in the EU, the problem was, because the currency is tied together with strong economies, they couldn't use all of these techniques that are usually for small economies that are a bit of in a slump. So it was, as you say, it's a trade-off. It's good, but also bad. It's always an interesting. So the EU had a bit of a stressful time with that, and the Greeks had a lot of issues back then because they weren't able. There was discussions about a small euro extra just for the weaker nations, weak economies. But just wanted to point out that also nowadays, even we still have the same issues with the trade-offs. And it's a good thing to have the debate of, okay, if we do something, what is the trade-off? Okay, you want to buy it, you want to sell it, you're going to tell me the good thing, but what is the bad thing about it? There's always two sides of the coin. So to have an elaborate discussion, it's always important to shine light on both sides. I'm absolutely on your side with that.
Yeah, exactly. There's always a trade-off. So those were the two monetary systems. The first one for thousands of years, and then over the last hundreds of years, the commodity-backed money systems kind of evolved. And then in 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, thrust the entire world out of a commodity-backed monetary system into a fiat system. And So what most people don't understand about the current fiat monetary system is that it is a ledger monetary system. So there are two types of ledgers. There are private ledgers and there are public ledgers. Many people are familiar with Bitcoin, but the technological complexities make it a little bit intimidating for some people. So the only thing that most people need to understand about Bitcoin is that it's an Excel spreadsheet. And imagine in the first column, you have a list of all the account numbers. And then in the second column, you have a list of all the money in each of those accounts. And then you have a list of all the transactions that took place in all the accounts, all the way back to the very first transaction. And that's all Bitcoin is. And that spreadsheet is accessible by anybody who wants to access it. And because there are so many people or computers looking at the spreadsheet, if anybody goes in and tries to make a change to it, everybody will recognize, hey, that change happened. Like, so we know that's not real. So we all have a copy of the real one. And so because it's such a large network of so many people looking at that spreadsheet, it's difficult to impossible to kind of break it. And that's all it is. It's literally just a list of numbers. And now people look at that and say, well, I'm going to look at the amount of Bitcoin that I have as, as money. And so if I want to have Bitcoin in my Bitcoin account, then I have to do something to convince somebody else to give me some of that Bitcoin. So commonly, what I will do is I'll give them dollars or I'll give them euros and they'll give me some of their Bitcoin. And then that transaction will be recorded on that public spreadsheet forever. But I don't have to give them dollars or euros for it. I could give them a pizza for it. I could give them 8 hours of labor for it. I could give them anything. And as long as they agree, I give them something, they give me the Bitcoin in return, then that transaction happens when they send the Bitcoin. So that's all a ledger is. It's just a list of accounts with the amount of money in each of those accounts and the transactions. And Bitcoin is a public ledger. So that's, that's what it means that, everybody can see it basically. And the rules governing when money is sent, when money is not sent, if transactions could be changed or anything, that's public as well. So that's basically the entire network decides those rules, and the way that Bitcoin's rules are set out are publicly known, and that basically if money is going to go from one account to another, it's got to be initiated by the person who has the money to send, the Bitcoin to send. Today's regular monetary system, like banks, this is also a ledger system. It's a private ledger system, though. And so every bank has an Excel spreadsheet that has a list of all the account numbers at that bank, the names associated with each account number, their birthdays, their government IDs, and all that, the amount of money in each of those accounts, and then all the transactions that took place in those accounts. That's all a ledger is, and that's all a bank is, because we don't have anything backing it up anymore. There's no redemptions to be made. There's no claim on a commodity. It's just a list. And then when money gets sent from one bank to another, those two banks go to each other and they say, okay, I'm going to send you $100. So I'm going to subtract $100 from, my money. You're going to add $100 to yours, and we make sure that they're accurate with each other. And then, we call it a day. So the monetary system we have today is a decentralized, private ledger monetary system. A bunch of different banks maintaining their own ledgers, and only those banks can control their own ledgers. So right now in the United States, there are some issues over the last couple of years with certain types of businesses getting shut down by their banks, their bank accounts getting shut down. So businesses that sell firearms, businesses that sell marijuana, businesses that sell gold or silver coins.
Just let me ask you, just give me, for all the viewers from Europe who don't know about the American situation, are we talking, or the legal situation, are these illegal businesses? So it's like, okay, no, you did the crime and we're gonna freeze the bank account because you did crimes, or were those legal businesses where you say, hey man, we were legal, we followed all rules, and we still got shut down or frozen accounts suddenly?
Great. That's a great question. And I'm glad you made that distinction. These are all 100% legal. So there's no criminal activity going on. These are, registered businesses. They're real businesses. They're following the law. They pay their taxes and all that. But there are certain businesses that have, different, stigmas, or,
Yeah.
the banks are private companies. And so
Yeah.
banks may not want to do business with other companies that are engaging in certain business activities. And,
Like the
and so
OnlyFans
like
discussion.
a bit,
Yeah. Like the
yes,
OnlyFans
I was just going to
discussion.
bring that up.
Now we
Big
don't want to
example.
have to
Yes.
do with sexual things or this and that. And America is a bit
Mm-hmm.
on the more prude side compared to, like, let's say, Europe. So the values a bank has, or many companies have, they're like, we can't risk doing stuff like that. We
Mm-hmm.
can't risk it for our public image. But I didn't know that they could just like cancel the accounts. I thought it would be like protected by law or something like that.
Yeah, so the money, it's not like they're stealing the money, but
Yeah.
they issue a notice to the business and say, we're going to close your account. You have 30 days to withdraw your funds and go somewhere else. And so there's a that is an issue, but there are usually other banks that will take that business. And so there usually is somewhere else for them to go. So in our current system, we've got this decentralized or distributed ledger system that is a bunch of different private ledgers. And the banks can shut down transactions, they can pull back transactions, they can control those ledgers. Now, some of the problems with this are that settlement times take a really long time. It's very difficult and costly and slow to send money across state borders, across national borders. It's very difficult to do business if you're one of those kind of businesses that I mentioned, because you've got issues with the banks maybe not wanting to do business with you. So you've got a bunch of little issues popping up. And then right now we're experiencing the issue of banks not being stable enough. And so the way that banks make money is they take your dollar and then they go and they buy an asset with it. And so that dollar is not actually there. Or most of those dollars are not there. And so if everybody tries to get their money out of the bank at the same time, the bank is forced to sell all the assets that they bought. And right now, across the world, basically every asset that almost every bank owns is worth less than when they bought it. And so any bank that gets a run on the bank would be forced to shut down because they wouldn't have enough to meet all those redemptions. And this is an issue. This is a layer that's left over from old monetary systems when money was backed by commodities that needed redemption, and you have private businesses trying to make money with that. And so we do have a lot of issues. I'll stop there because it looked like you were going to make a note.
Yeah, I was just to point it out. It's not a momentary issue right now because we've had like the the interest rates of the central banks and other issues like the supply chain issues. And so it's not that. The issue is it's built into the system that all banks always are technically bankrupt because they owe more money than they have, because they give the money that they have. Well, if you have 10 depositors, the bank gets the money of all of them, and they will take that money and do something with it, and they will loan out more money, not one-to-one, but they will loan out more money than they have ever gotten. That's an important thing for the viewers to know. It's not like, okay, we're in it's like called in the news the credit crunch, or it's something that will always be built into the system in the way it is built right now. That a bank always has the issue that if all people go and want to get their money, that it's impossible that all of them get it. That's just a technicality that is right now. So it's built into the system. Just wanted the people to know about that, so they don't think it's like, okay, right now some issue.
Right. Yes. And so the only time that it doesn't feel like an issue is when those assets are still worth, full price. Because then if they had to sell all those assets, then they could most likely get, enough to be able to meet the redemptions. But then at that point, they have no more money. So they go under. The depositors get their money, but they go under because they've got nothing left. And so, yes, there's, it's the way that banks operate. It's the foundational system that is broken. And so I'll enter into the discussion a central bank digital currency and how it fixes a lot of these issues before I talk about how dangerous they are. So a central bank digital currency does very simply one thing. It just makes one ledger for the money instead of a bunch of different ledgers at a bunch of different banks. That's it. And it makes that ledger with the central bank. So like right now, when you go to the grocery store, you swipe your card, you send money from your bank account, which is with money's at one bank, and it goes to another bank, account that's held at a different bank. So banks are constantly sending money back and forth. There's settlement issues. There's issues where you say, hey, no, they took too much money. Like, this is fraud, and they don't have the records. And that's why there's a lot of these slow issues, costly issues, settlement across state lines, things like that. So a central bank digital currency, because they put it all onto one ledger, the central bank doesn't have any of those issues. To move money from my account to your account, it's just a change on the Excel spreadsheet. So I can do that instantly. Guess what? I can do that for free. And since I have a record of every single transaction, because it's all on one spreadsheet, I can go back and I can see if an error was made, whether we sent too much money based on your request. I can instantly undo errors, things like that. And so because it's centralized all under one, it fixes the speed issue. It fixes the cost issue. It fixes some security issues with, employees at private banks having access to personal information about people. And the biggest one right now that people will probably care about is that it fixes the issue of bank insolvency, because no longer do you need to take dollars and then loan them out, create an asset in order to keep the bank rolling along for depositors. If you just have one Excel spreadsheet at the central bank is the one with the monopoly on creating the new money out of thin air. So in order to finance its own operations, all it does is it credits more money to its own account to finance its operations. And so it doesn't need to take your dollars and loan them out to create an asset. So your dollars will just stay there. Nothing's happening to them because there's nothing really there. It's just a line item on a spreadsheet. That's it. And so the problem of bank insolvency, of your dollars being loaned out over and over again, it goes away. Everybody could go and withdraw their money at the same time. But in order to do that, to take your money out, you have to spend it somewhere else. Like, you wouldn't be able to just go get it in cash. And so you in order to take it from your account, it's got to go to somebody else's account. So it all stays at the central bank 100% of the time. 100% of the money is at the central bank. It's just switching which account it's in at the central bank. So you eliminate the risk of a bank run, you eliminate the risk of bank insolvency, and you eliminate all the speed and inefficiency issues. And so you do solve a lot of problems that our current system has, which is left over from all these older systems. So I'll stop there before we get into the dangers.
Okay, because a few of those things do sound like interesting and positive. Like, as you said, the security aspect, you can see years later who transacted what money to what other account. Like with cash, we don't know where that cash came from exactly and where was it before and before the owner of the one who had it right now. Everybody's going to talk about crime, about bribery, about all of these different aspects of money laundering, because that would technically, I think, not just technical, but it would be possible. It would be with, I think there's going to be some kind of twist where it's still working in some way, but it would be much, much, much harder. And every transaction would always be recorded and linked to the person who has that wallet or that line item or however they're going to call it. But as you said, the issue also is no cash. Of course, it doesn't work with cash because I can't take the money out of the ledger and then give it to someone else in cash, and the ledger wouldn't know that there was a transaction between me and that other person. All of the transactions have to be completely digital. Okay, that's interesting take. Yeah. So, I mean, my spidey senses are already tingling. Like, there are a few things. Europe has a bit of a history with people who want to have a bit too much authority. Like, we have had quite a few such examples over the centuries. But I'll let you explain more of the
Mhm.
dangers of this idea and system.
Yeah, essentially, you get all of the all of the dangers of controlling a system concentrated in the most centralized way possible. So there's a big push right now from the ECB and the Bank of England saying, hey, this, if when we roll out our digital pound or digital euro, it's not going to be programmable. But that's a misunderstanding about what a CBDC is. By nature, it is programmable. Now, what they're trying to communicate is that we won't program it to change it and use it to benefit us. But that's a very different thing than saying it's not programmable. By definition, it is programmable because it is programmed. And so you have, like, right now we have the issue of, like I said, businesses maybe getting pushed out by banks. Well, now all that is concentrated into one. And so if somebody decides at the central bank that it is a risk to economic stability for any specific action, they could immediately prevent that action from taking place. And so, like, for instance, most central banks are tasked with controlling inflation. And so if they look and they see their transactions now, they're not looking at the general level of inflation. They're looking at individual prices of everything because they have all that data now. And they see prices of fuel going up. They doubled in the last month, let's say. They could look at that and say, hey, that is going to be an issue for economic stability. And our job is to prevent inflation. So we need to stop transactions from happening after a certain amount for fuel, because then that will put a cap on the price, because you cut off demand, you cut off the price rise. So they could institute in real time a ration on fuel in order to save the economy, in order to prevent inflation. And that's just one example. They could literally stop any transaction from taking place, reverse any transaction from taking place. In order to stimulate spending, they could give everybody $1,000 that would be, that would expire after a month. They could actually delete money from people's accounts if they wanted to, because people had too much money and they were causing inflation. They could put a wealth cap in place where if somebody had more than $1 million, any new transactions that come into the account just disappear. So it is pure 100% tyrannical control over the financial system. And the thing to understand about money is that it's one half of everything that everybody does. There is no action that people take in the course of our day-to-day lives that do not involve a financial transaction. We go home to a house that we're paying for, in a car that we're paying for, with fuel that we're paying for, paid for with, we've got insurance that we're paying for on it. We go out to eat, we pay for it. We go groceries, we go out on a date, we go to work, exchange our time for money. Literally everything that everybody does all day long, one half of that is money. So if you can control 100% the money, you can influence all human behavior. It is 100% tyrannical control over a system. And just because they say they won't use it in a bad way is no guarantee that it won't utterly fail, because power corrupts, and the more power a system has, the more it will attract the people who want to use that power for their own benefit. And so it is just, regardless of the incentives or the benefits that system will have, the dangers far outweigh any advantages.
I know that sentence and that sentiment is a very American thing, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You hear it very often. I like the sentiment of freedom also. And what you talk right now, I want to just make it clear to the viewers. You talked more about the economic aspects now, but nobody says that it will be only that area. We know, like, the famous examples of social credit scores. It's like, oh, they're gonna ration this because of inflation. Well, yeah, maybe, but also maybe you get a deduction or some fine because you talked to this wrong person, because you posted the wrong stuff, because you did something that this government does not like. Just like that, it's easy, because once the system is in place and once it's normal and widespread, it can, I'm not saying it will, but it can be used that way. And as you say, it's like, if you look at the history, the last 1,000 years, the last 2,000 years, if the government can do something, it's like easier that it does it. Like, When I was back in the military, for example, it was like, if you don't lock up your stuff, you get a punishment because you made someone a thief, because you made it possible for him to steal from your stuff. And it's like with the government the same. If you give them the chance, who are they to not take advantage of that chance, of those possibilities that they have? So I understand that sentiment and that issue a lot, because it's not like it's just a fairy tale idea. We've seen things that come close to this happening in the last few years, like, as you say, banks shutting down because they don't like specific kind of industries or shops. You in America, for example, have a big discussion about the Second Amendment. For the views out of Europe, it's the discussion about having the right to own arms, guns, weapons, and so on, to protect yourself, with the idea that you're also supposed to protect yourself against a tyrannical government. So the discussion of the government wanting to make it harder to get them is, of course, splitting the American people apart. But also examples like in Canada with the trucker protests, where suddenly accounts were frozen. We've seen it in China where stuff got frozen. We've seen it now with the Ukraine and Russia crisis, of course, in a much larger scale, but also like in the small scale where, for example, well, you're a wealthy Russian. We think you're in connection with Putin. You're one of his big thugs. So we're going to seize your stuff and we're going to freeze your accounts. We in Austria, for example, had for a few years ago a terror attack from a specific group. And there it was also, okay, we're going to go through X accounts, we're going to freeze them, we're going to look at who has done what to get to the bottom of things. Well, how widespread will that be used? I think it's very much of a trust issue with many political topics nowadays. Weirdly, it's like people don't trust the governments anymore. Like a few decades ago, people were more like, I think they'll be all right. They won't take advantage of it. It will work out. They wouldn't be like this evil. And nowadays, somehow the sentiment is more like, oh man, the moment they can, they will. So it's interesting to see how that changed. And I want to ask you something about that, because I recently talked to a German economist and analyst and so on. And he was like, yeah, the ECB and the Fed, they're idiots. And I was like, well, do you think they're incompetent? Or do you think they're lying? That they're outright lying, saying like inflation is transitory, even though so many people, so many advisors, so many consultants, all on YouTube and worldwide said, it's clear that that's not transitory. And still they push that story. And I asked him, if it like, they just say that to not cause a mass panic, even though they know, like, come on, all the guys who know about it know how to move first so they can benefit from it, or if he genuinely believed that the ECB and the Feds were that incompetent. And his opinion was they are really that incompetent. He believes that they really don't understand the market, that they're living in an ivory tower, not understanding any of the stuff they're talking about. I would like to know your opinion. Is it more that they're incompetent, or do you think, well, man, they're saying something and know that that's not the truth of what they say, and they've got another plan in the back of their mind? What's your take on that?
I have two opinions. My first opinion is that that the only thing that matters is not intentions, but results. And so whether they are incompetent or whether they are malevolent, their actions are producing specific results. And that I guess from the average person's perspective, like the results are the same either way. Now, I do think that there is a lot more evidence that it's incompetence rather than malevolence, because when you look at the big things that most large governments try to do, they are extremely inefficient. I mean, even if you look at when the incentives are aligned properly, and you look at large for-profit organizations that try and do things, organizations are extremely inefficient at doing things the larger they get. And the worse the incentives are aligned, the worse the outcomes tend to be. And And so, and many times you actually get the opposite outcome. For instance, like the big push in the United States for funding for awareness and healthy habits in the United States. The result of that was over the next like 20 years, the obesity rate just exploded, like doubled or tripled in the United States. And so,
Really? Oh man.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's just when you get the incentives wrong, and when you get a large enough, bureaucratic enough organization, the incompetence can actually produce opposite results. And then when you look at the people who have actually worked there, so there's this great book called Fed Up by Danielle DiMartino Booth, and she used to work at the Federal Reserve, and she discussed the kind of day-to-day life of the people who work there. Number one, they're all PhDs. They all come from the exact same schools that are all teaching the exact same school of economic thought. And none of them have ever had a real job in their life. Straight through academic, straight to the Federal Reserve. And that's where they spend their entire career. So they have no experience starting a business. They have no experience getting a job. They have no experience actually living through cycles and recessions and what it feels like to have prices go up and to lose your job and to be going for a promotion and to like all of the stuff that normal people, citizens live through. They have no concept of this. So that's the first piece. Even during recessions, like on Wall Street, bonuses get cut, people get fired. Yes, during the good times, they live high on the hog, and during the bad times, they all get slaughtered. And that's just not true at places like the Federal Reserve. They all clock in and clock out at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. and take their hour-long lunch, and they get their paychecks that are above what the industry would pay outside, and they go home and they have no idea what it's like to live in the real world. And then finally, that thing that I mentioned about like their school of thought, how they're all trained to think the exact same way, means that number one, they're using models that are wrong because they're just empirically proven to not work. And then number two, they're using data that is backwards looking. And so for the data to get through the real world all the way up to be accumulated and make its way to the Fed, and then for them to start to go through that data and try and run it through their models and accumulate it and watch trends, they're looking at stuff that's months or sometimes even years old. And so they're not looking ahead. They're not even looking at what's happening right now. They're looking at what's already happened in the rearview mirror. And so that is, I think, their training, the models they use, the data that they look at, and their lack of connection to the real world makes their actions produce the results that they do.
Man, that made me think of like playing a racing game with a lag of 5 seconds, where you see 5 seconds after you did something where your instructions are happening or what they are causing. But it's interesting to think that's a good book that you suggested. I'll order that. That's really interesting because of course all of these people are from the same circles. They learn the same things. They are not just they learn the same things. They are taught to interpret it in a specific way. Like if this happens, then you have to think of it happening like that next. That's, man, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I always thought, and I still like in my core, I still think a bit like, nah, they know what they know about it. Like they know, and they just like, as for example, they don't want to cause a big bank run, so they say no, everything is safe because they know it's not. If people had understood inflation is coming heavy, how many people would have stockpiled stuff when it was still cheap? So it's like, okay, it's gonna get worse if we say outright, oh yeah, inflation is gonna burn and get high and everything. So I'm not sure. I hope, I'm not sure if I hope that they're malevolent or incompetent. I don't know which word is better, honestly. But I think one of those solutions would be the CBDC. To get all of that done by those people in the ivory tower who are either incompetent or malevolent. One of those two, and they're supposed to get all of the control over all of the economy, and they won't be able to hold back. I've had an interview recently with a guy, liberal from a European think tank, a Hungarian guy, and we discussed an issue that politicians have too, like now in defense of the politician wants. It's they have a job, and most people misunderstand the job of a politician. The job of a politician is to get elected. That's what their job is. That's what they get money for. That's, if they don't get that done, they're fired. That's the only thing that really matters for a politician, to get elected. And if, for example, in Austria now and in many European countries, I'm not sure how it was in America when the prices went up now. We have a big culture of demanding regulations and like price cuts and rationing and all of that. The people themselves demand it. For like the government has to step in, they have to make something, they have to do something, it can't get on and so on and so. No free market, it's not working, as we can see. We want the politicians to step in. Not stepping in as a politician in that climate would be political suicide. Let's be honest, it's impossible. So I don't know what is like the American take on that with the general population, but if there is a way for the politicians in that situation to take direct control, like through the CBDC, they will have to use it, because the people will even demand it, and they won't think through like the next step or 3 steps ahead. They will just think, okay, I've got an issue now, I want that issue solved, that's something that can solve it, do it, no matter the consequences. So it's like Pandora's box is being opened. What is it like in America? Is the danger of the population demanding it realistic there too? Or is it more, no, you're more freedom and free market society overall that says, no, we don't want regulations, even if it fucks us over as an individual, we don't want the government to step in?
There's a study that was done recently that plotted the likelihood of policy coming into effect, and how that correlates with the popularity of that policy in America. And so if you survey people and you say, okay, hey, there's this policy that's being proposed, and 100% of people say absolutely not, none of us want that, the likelihood of that being put in place and becoming law is about 30%. So everybody says no, you've got about a 1/3 chance that it actually becomes law. And then you go to the other side of the spectrum and you've got a policy that is that 100% of the people say, yes, we really want this, do this. You've got about a 30% chance of it becoming law. So it's 30% across the board.
Really? It's like, yeah, the sentiment of the people doesn't matter at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Whether people don't want it at all, really want it, or some people do, some people don't, the likelihood of anything becoming law is in the United States is about 30%. And so I do agree with you that the job of a politician is to get elected, but the more scale you involve in a system, that looks different. So at a very local scale, in order to get elected, you do have to show like results. And so like at a city level and like at a town level or a neighborhood level, there's a lot of skin in the game. So you have to show results. And so in order to get elected and stay in power, you've got to be doing the things that people want. But the more you scale that system up and increase the number of people in that system, then it becomes less and less about the results after the fact and more about the popularity contest before the election. And so the results afterwards about what they actually do with policy don't actually matter as much.
Thank you for that explanation. For me as a European, it was always a bit confusing with the presidential campaigns, like, hey, they don't really talk that much about policies. But of course, the USA are big, and the European countries are more like the single states of your country. Well, not all, of course, it's different, and don't want to oversimplify, but of course it's like the state level elections are more of the national elections in our area. Like, okay, that makes sense, because of course, what am I gonna choose from the other side of the continent? Like the policies, man. Okay. Interesting, very interesting take. Thank you for that. It's always been a bit of a confusing factor. But let me jump to another little thing, because CBDC, danger of tyranny, getting out of the system. I watch, of course, many videos, many different takes on YouTube, on different blogs, consultants, and so. And I personally think a lot of them are a bit naive, like saying, "Oh, you got to take your cash out." Like we've seen it in India or other countries. It's like the cash will be just declared illegal. Not illegal, like, okay, you will be fined, but like, okay, you can't use it anymore as a currency. Like I can't use the shilling and the Germans can't use the Deutsche Mark anymore because no, now we have the euro and you can't pay with the other stuff. So a few of them say like, go in on gold. And with the gold prices, there is a very interesting take about the differences of the physical gold in the market and the paper gold market and what the different central banks are doing right now. It's like you're the expert on this. Could you tell us a bit, or my views, like, okay, what is going on with the central banks, with the paper market, and with the physical market of gold? Because is gold a hedge against this? Is it not really working? Is it? What is your opinion on that? All of that. Sorry if the questions is a bit all over the place. Let me
Yeah,
clarify.
no.
What do you think about the central banks, the CBDC, and the role of gold in the future?
Central banks are throughout the last couple of decades, they've either been sellers or buyers of gold. When you look at all central banks, aggregate them together, they've either been on net sellers or net buyers. And since 2008, they've been buyers of gold. And so there are certainly some central banks that have been selling gold from time to time, but altogether, central banks have been buying gold. And during 2022 and continuing into 2023, central banks are currently buying gold at the fastest pace in 70 years, since 1950. The last time they got this close was in 1967. Now, 1967 preceded 1968, which is when the London gold pool collapsed. And then 3 years after that, the gold window closed and the gold standard, the gold exchange standard ended. So basically what you see happening is central banks around the world, they are able to sniff out sovereign debt crises. They're able to sniff out when governments are not going to be able to pay their debts and currencies are going to be debased. And so they buy gold because gold is nobody else's liability. So right now you have that same thing going on. You have governments all around the world that have more debt than they've ever had. They've got a higher debt to GDP ratio than they've ever had. They've got higher rates of inflation than they've had in decades. And so they're not able to print their way out of it. And they don't have a big enough tax base to be able to tax their way out of it. And so you've either got a technical or a nominal default by governments all around the world coming up soon. And so central banks know this, and that's why they're buying gold. Because yes, central banks own debt. They have treasuries, they have sovereign debt, but they're looking at this and saying there's risk of that just not having any value in the future. And if that's the case, I do still need something that has value, and they're buying gold as a result of this. And they're buying physical gold. So gold is like, it's leaving the exchanges, it's going into it's leaving the system and going into central bank vaults. And so that's the first thing, is that central banks are sniffing out again something that they haven't. That it looks like they're mimicking something they haven't done since before the last gold standard ended, which was the last large, sovereign debt default. And so that's why they're buying gold right now. Now, in terms of the gold price and the paper gold market, all commodities have paper contracts that are traded for them, and that provides liquidity into the market. But you can also present some abuse on that system, and so you can go in with a relatively small amount of money and you can short gold, a much larger amount of gold than you would be able to if you had to put up the entire amount of cash for it. And so it's possible, not proven, but it looks like what central banks are doing through other financial institutions is shorting gold because that's selling pressure. So that keeps the price down. And then at the same time, because you receive money when you make a short, they're using that money to go buy physical gold, and they get physical delivery. And so it looks like a large coordinated scheme to keep the price of gold down as low as possible so that they can accumulate as much physical gold as possible. Now, the nice thing about this is that number one, that means the price of gold is lower for anybody who wants to buy gold. It's not just lower for the central banks. Number two, it means that those shorts have to get unwound at some point, because in order to close out a long trade, you have to sell. In order to close out a short trade, you have to buy. And so any amount of manipulation that is keeping the price lower than it should be means it will eventually revert and get back to its fair value. And so what that means is that if it is happening, then buying gold right now presents an opportunity to buy a gold at a discount, and the fair value is higher than it is. And when they finally allow it to go back up, or it breaks and it forces its way back up because there's no more physical left, then the price of gold would, shoot back up to where it was supposed to be. And so I do think that following that model of what central banks are doing is smart, not for 100% of your money, but they're buying gold because they know their paper is worthless. They know their government debt is worthless. And so they're buying gold. And so we should probably do the same with at least a portion of our assets, because in the case of a sovereign debt default, in the case of hyperinflation, in the case of a deflationary debt spiral, you at least preserve your purchasing power. And maybe it gets outlawed, but at least you can still buy something on a parallel market or the black market. You have some purchasing power because that gold's value doesn't depend on somebody else making good on their promise.
The interesting take on this is with the paper gold market. It's not proven as far as I know, but it's like the gold bugs like whisper about it, that there is more gold being traded than there really is physically. Because there's
that's true. That's just, you just look at the size of the futures markets and the capital required to trade that. And that is definitely true. There's a lot more gold being traded, but that's also fairly common among all commodities because of the leverage involved. And so what's debated is the conspiracy behind it, the intention behind it.
Yeah. And that's also what, for example, you and others, many others on YouTube and so on, also make the distinction and tell the people between the difference of if you buy gold, if it's, I think the English term was allocated gold or not. Could you just, in a short term for the viewers, explain it?
Yeah, when you buy gold from the majority of gold dealers, if you're gonna take it and hold it yourself, and that's one thing entirely, you actually have the gold, so that's great. If you're gonna pay somebody else to store it for you because you don't want to have it physically, there's two different kinds. There's unallocated and there's allocated. Basically, it's all there, or only a fraction of it is there. Allocated means there's an actual piece of gold sitting in a vault that belongs to you and it belongs to nobody else. Unallocated, all that means, what that really means is that they owe you the gold. So if you ever call them up and say, hey, give me the gold, they don't actually have it. They go out onto the market at that point and they buy the gold and then send it to you. And so the danger with that is, in a squeeze, when everybody's scrambling to get gold, everybody's going to call them up and say, send it to me. They're not going to have the money to buy the gold at the higher price that it's at that point, and they'll go out of business. And because you're just a creditor at that point, they just owe you the gold. You may not get anything. Versus allocated gold means it's actually there. And so if something were to happen to the business, they were to shut down, you have legal ownership over that. It can't get sold and go to the creditors of the business. That legally belongs to you. So you own that gold. So you're just paying them to store it for you. So that's the main difference. You just want to look for allocated gold. It's better if it's segregated. It's better if it's insured, privately audited, and it's best if it's in a vault that's not a government vault and not in a country with a history of gold confiscation.
Because there was another point that in many countries, when there were such situations, they just declared gold illegal to own or to have or to use as a currency. It's also something that happened in quite a few countries over the time and over the last century, let's say a bit more than a century. I think it's interesting, like the saying from the Eastern Europeans, like when Yugoslavia broke apart back in the 90s, for example. It was like everything was fine. You had your money in the bank, everything. The next morning you woke up, you went to the bank, and it was just closed. They told me, it was like, man, it was just closed. You had no clue why it was closed. And you found out through the news afterwards that, hey, your money gone. it's gone. And that's why a lot of people from Eastern Europe, for example, or also much older Germans, they're like, no, 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 if you don't have it in your pocket, if you don't have it somewhere buried in your own garden, you don't have it. Like, of course, if everything went good, no problem. But when it comes push to shove, only what you have in your hand counts. Everything else, no matter how safe, insured, how whatever, you can't count on it. Well, that's the sentiment, at least from these people who like experienced crashes on another intensity than most of the Western world has experienced. Like we're a bit coddled when it comes to that. For us, a crash is like, oh my God, the stocks lost 10 or 20% value, and like, wow, that's a crash for us. And other countries experience like, whoa, suddenly there is no food, and there are major issues, and all of your money is gone. So that's an interesting take. And it brings me to another point that I just want to make, because of usually gold and assets are often used as a hedge against inflation too. And I heard your point also being like, you can get a loan or use your money that might lose the value through inflation and buy assets. Like, good if you have assets that don't depreciate in value, even better if you buy assets that create cash flow, like that's adaptable to the. I'm a bit curious because back in Germany, when the hyperinflation era was, I just wanted to tell you, so you know, maybe to look into it. The government stepped in and said, whoa, now all of the houses were paid off technically by the inflation, all the real estate, but that's unfair to the population. That's just unfair. So the government said all of the real estate owners have to pay a 50% tax on this estate. With the new value, they were signed into the ground book. It's like, who owns it? And if they didn't pay off that tax in, I don't know anymore, it's like in X years, then the estate was confiscated and sold and taken away. So just want to warn the people who think, okay, I'm going to go all in with taking loans and buying assets. Even that, if you don't have a good idea for the cash flow and how to handle the money afterwards, it can also lead to ruin, because that's also a dangerous game. But what are your thoughts on, you often discuss inflation, deflation, which of these two is more likely to happen in your opinion? Because as you said, inflation means the buying power gets lower, so we need to use more and more nominal value to buy the same thing. On the other side, if an economy crashes, the demand crashes too. And usually the lower the demand is, the cheaper the prices become. Because, well, if everyone is broke, nobody's gonna buy for example, now the houses. And if the bank can't give me a loan, and if nobody can afford it, all of these houses, someone has to buy them, and they can then buy it, as I say, for cents on the dollar. So how does that play out? I see somehow like inflation and deflation can be simultaneous, but it's something that I don't see often being discussed in economic terms. Am I making a mistake with understanding that these two powers can be happening at the same time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes. So basically, there's a couple things. So when we discuss inflation and deflation, we have to define what we're talking about, because there are very different ways that can be used. There are going to be certain items whose prices are rising while other prices are falling. That's really not what a lot of people refer to when they're talking about inflation or deflation. Today, most of the time when people are talking about inflation or deflation, they're talking about, on average, when you look at the prices of most things that most people buy, and then aggregate that together, is that level going up or going down? And so it will either go up, go down, or stay flat. Prices of everything all together at the same time can't be doing both. It's just, we have one number. But what you're talking about is one of two things. It's either a time difference, or it's a difference in experience. And so I'll give you the time difference first, because this is what I think will actually happen. Right now, we have, I'll give you, in the United States, we have inflation. But inflation is measured year over year. So when you look at the prices from April of 2022 to the prices right now in April of 2023, prices are higher right now on average of everything. Some prices are lower, some prices are higher, but on average, everything is higher. But when you look at the prices from 1 month ago to today, prices on average have barely changed at all, like almost nothing. Further, when you take it a step further and you plot the year-over-year difference in January, and then February, and then March, and then April, when you look at those year-over-year differences, you see that those year-over-year differences are getting smaller. So this is what's called disinflation. So in January, the prices were, let's say, 8% higher than they were the year before. And then the next month, they're only 7% higher than they were the year before. And then February, 6%. And now they're 5% higher than they were the year before. If you keep this trend up, then eventually that rate hits zero, because it approaches zero. So prices stop rising at some point in order to make that happen. When you look at the mechanism that causes inflation or deflation, especially recently, the majority of the time, it's going to be the broad money supply. And so when you look at in 2020 and 2021, we had a massive growth in the money supply, and that caused record-breaking inflation. But the money supply stopped expanding anywhere between 12 to 18 months ago. And actually, year over year, the money supply has shrunk. So the money supply has started to decline since then. And given the fact that we know how much of an influence the money supply growth has on prices, because if there's more money, works its way throughout the system, it bids up prices, you start to suck money out of the system. That means on average, there's not enough money to continue affording everything at those higher prices. So prices have to come down to meet the lower amount of money in the system to buy things, because there's just not enough money to buy those things at those higher prices. So you have all of the forces right now for deflation to come next. Now, that means that there's less money going around. And that looks like that's what's happening right now, or will soon happen, because you've got bank failures, you've got people stopping spending, you've got people with so much debt that they can't afford to continue to load up on more debt to pay their old debt, or maybe bankruptcies happen and then you have people losing their assets. And so you've got all these forces right now that are contributing towards prices going down, people losing their jobs, incomes going down. Every one person's expense is another person's income. So we've got a lot of deflationary forces building up right now. And on average, that would push prices down, because there's just not enough money on average to keep on buying everything at those higher prices. So either that doesn't get bought and then prices really collapse because there's no transaction, or prices come down to the point where people will keep on buying them. Now, I think the deflationary forces have enough of a damaging effect that policymakers step in and try and cause inflation to happen again. And so I do think that we have deflation and then inflation, high inflation after that. But the immediate outcome is deflation. We're not on the path towards high inflation or hyperinflation at the moment. I think we'll experience deflation first. The difference in experiences that you were referring to, where it seems like there's inflation and deflation happening at the same time, it comes down to the fact that when you look at the experiences that people have when there's hyperinflation, like let's say the Weimar Republic in Germany, you look at the experience that people have in America in the Great Depression. One of those was hyperinflation. One of those was a deflationary death spiral. The day-to-day experiences look identical. Like there's just, people don't have enough money to get the stuff that they want and need. Now, in one case, the way that looks is that prices are exploding higher, and the other case that looks like prices are dropping off a cliff. But in both cases, the day-to-day experience is the real things that people want and need are inaccessible. and the cost of human labor to get those things is too high, or there's just shortages and those things are just not even available. And so the real ramifications of both hyperinflation or deflation are the same, because they're both examples of deleveraging. That money, that purchasing power has already been spent in the past. And so that deleveraging can unfold in an inflationary way or a deflationary way. But either way, it is a deleveraging, and the total stock of wealth has to be rebuilt back up.
And it won't be a pleasant experience for the people, at least not for the average Joe, let's say it like that. Because if you've got a lot of money, I'm sure you can play the game and even profit off of those times, but that's gonna be hard. Well, Joe, I want to thank you very much. I think we're gonna quit it for today. I could talk to you for a few more hours. It's so interesting, so many questions, so much great content and different topics you cover. People, to all the viewers, I'll leave his link to his channel below. All of you should go over there, take a look at his stuff. It's really awesome. Once more, I want to thank you. I know you've got a family. Just the very best. And how do you say in English? Like, I wish the very best to all of your family for the future. And I thank you very much for participating in this interview. Bye.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.